Um, we're gonna get to Ilhan Omar in a minute, but I'm in a really difficult process right now because I'm almost done with the first draft of this book. But I've actually really enjoyed not doing segments on people like Sam Harris. But the way I want to frame this segment for you is, especially if you're the type of person who comes to me and says, I like both of you, or hey, I understand that Sam promoting racism through the bell curve wasn't so hot, but he's amazing on atheism or neuroscience or whatever. When I was probably in the age bracket of people who really get into this stuff, somewhere between like 18 and 22, I was a huge fan of this guy, Ken Wilber, who I actually still like. I think he's really interesting and worth reading. He wrote really interesting books on religion, on science, psychology. He was super trendy in like the early aughts and late 90s, and people like Bill Clinton loved him. And I remember when he started writing, I was in college, and he started writing more about things like politics, which I knew more about. And I was like, oh, that's wrong. Like you're messing up basic stuff here. And then I thought to myself, wait, so if that's that sloppy, should I really be taking this guy's word when he writes about like Newtonian physics, something which I know like less than nothing about, or, translations of Chinese Buddhist texts? Maybe not. Now, I still happen to think in his case that his theoretical models are actually super helpful and interesting, and I wish people were reading him instead of Jordan Peterson. But I use that as a door to this Sam Harris clip, because I would invite you to entertain the possibility that if Sam Harris's analysis of politics in the ideal 2020 candidate is so both empirically disconnected from reality and such a obvious projection, in fact, of like pure identity politics would actually be the only way to describe this, and so profoundly disconnected from, I'm not talking moral, I'm talking just a strategic assessment of where the Democratic Party is and also what would be required to win back the types of voters that he alludes to in this segment. Entertain the possibility that if he knows this little about politics, maybe he's overselling himself a little bit on other areas that he speaks with such sort of projected grand authority on. Here's Sam Harris a couple days ago on Joe Rogan talking about the ideal 2020 presidential candidate.
We have to find someone who can stand outside the circular firing squad, right? And it would be someone who's, it would be, in my view, it would be somebody like a younger Bloomberg, right? I mean, I don't think it's Bloomberg, but like somebody like a legit businessman who could call bullshit on all of Trump's fake business acumen, and
pause it.
Who's not?
Sorry, I have to do a pause it. Sam Harris may not recall, because Sam Harris is highly not history-oriented, which is actually a major part of the profound distortions and problems and, as he would call, mess of his work. But in very recent history, and to be fair to Sam, I know his people are extremely anxious about being fair to him, Mike Bloomberg wasn't the presidential candidate, but in 2016, Michael Bloomberg was given a primetime speaking slot at the DNC to make precisely this argument, that he made actual money himself and Trump was full of shit. So this has already been highly publicly aired material. In fact, that was the centerpiece of every public intervention that Michael Bloomberg had as one of the most prominent Hillary Clinton surrogates in the country. Anyways, go ahead.
Who's not ethically compromised, right? But who can get stuff done, and so
right,
and definitely not someone who feels the need to pander to the far left on these identity politics issues. I think identity politics is really going to be bad for us against Trump, because so much of the country, I mean, the crucial sliver of the country, I mean, you just have to ask yourself, who was it who voted for Obama and then, or twice, and then voted for Trump, right? Those people aren't racist. Those people are sick of being called racist. So what's happening on the left around identity politics and all of these, I mean, it's not that race problem, it's not that transgender issues don't have to be worked out. I mean, all of those are legit concerns, but the fact that that's the center of mass politically on the left in a nationwide election against someone like Trump, I just think that's an absolute recipe for disaster.
Okay, so do you see the fusion of concern trolling, disingenuousness, empirical falsehood, and then actually ways of, and this is very actually evocative of his Muslim method, which is just speaking out of his mouth, both sides of his mouth, which is like, hey, I don't want to hear about the transgender and race stuff all the time. Now, those are legitimate concerns, but I mean, people are tired of hearing about it. They're legitimate concerns, right? But then it's like, okay, first of all, the empirical evidence on Trump to Obama to Trump voters are actually very complicated, and they're multivariable. And the research, I think, from Sands actually indicates that because the electorate has been re-racialized in a certain way by Trump, that people who in 2020 held highly big, or 2012 held highly bigoted attitudes, but weren't given a method through which to express that, are now doing that because that message is being tailored to them. Then, you know what? I agree with Sam Harris. I think that there are a segment of voters in geographically vital states who were bought in by Donald Trump's economic scam and sick of the Democratic Party betraying them on economic issues. I still think that stands, and it stands certainly at the most geographically important point. Now, obviously, those people are not just people that flipped to Trump, white people that flipped to Trump. There's also the many, 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 many African-American voters that just didn't vote. And of course, Sam Harris isn't reading Malaika Jabali or reading any polls and doesn't know any of it. But what candidate do you think would be most primed to speak to and get those voters back who are worried about healthcare, deindustrialization, and oligarchs ripping them off? Oh, well, of course, a technocratic billionaire who says we can't afford Medicare for all and regularly undermines and speaks out against the most popular social programs in the country. This is just the part. And again, guys, you can look this up. There is no polling that indicates that there is a broad constituency for this. If you look at politics in a grid, there's people on the right in the Republican Party who are far right on social issues and economic issues. There's people in the Democratic Party who are left on economics and social. And there's some people in the actual middle who I would say are actually not necessarily socially conservative, but they are socially moderate, socially centrist, however you're defining that. And they're with us on the banks and on Medicare for all and those issues. And then there's this little tiny cluster that probably literally includes the green room of Morning Joe and Sam Harris, of people who are like, I don't hate gay people. I'm pretty terrified of black people. And I don't mind slightly paying a little bit more taxes because I'm incredibly wealthy, but I don't want a big social safety net. That is the American elite. There is no electoral base for it. The only time maybe there was in the mid-90s at the peak of the tech bubble. And Bill Clinton also ran to the right on social issues. Now, again, I know I'm sorry that I'm not speaking in thought experiments, but this is like actual political reality that he's wading into. Add to it, there are plenty of people who are speaking out about the rights of transgender people and race, because those are fundamental justice and equity issues of our time. Nobody, even the most woke candidate, and all the Democratic candidates that are viable are actually, at least rhetorically, on the same page on these rights issues. Nobody has a single Democratic candidate who's announced yet. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, I'm forgetting people, Julian Castro. Did anybody, I hope, and I'm not sure, but I hope they all mentioned some type of serious equity agenda across the board in their campaign speeches. Are any of them building a campaign around a Twitter hashtag on wokeness? Is that happening for any candidate? Yeah. Anyone? No. What he's actually alluding to is that the Obama administration in the last couple of years changed a federal rule on transgender people rights, and there was some backlash to that. Although, again, empirically, if you actually break down the numbers, it did not cost the Democrats any votes. The people that voted against it and were most freaked out about it were not in the pocket of voters anyways. There was no segment that you could actually measure of people that were like, oh yeah, I was totally going to vote for Democrats, but because I'm so freaked out by sharing a bathroom with somebody or whatever the fuck else is going on in your head to actually motivate you to vote in such a ludicrous, fear-based way that I flip my vote. It's not empirically valid. It's not empirically sound.
And it's also just fucking wrong. Like, the thing about Sam Harris is, like, he's talking this old trope that's been in American politics for decades. It's like, oh, what we need is a neutral businessman to come in and they'll win president because people can agree on the center. Nobody fucking wants that. Even politicians, like, we could talk about Obama and, like, his legacy being sort of centrist. Obama wasn't running and presenting himself as, like, a centrist guy. Obama had a very, like, a bold campaign that really inspired people and had a lot of energy behind it. Americans don't want to vote for, and same thing with Donald Trump. Not in a good way, but Donald Trump was, very loud and there was energy because he was saying, crazy right-wing stuff, right? But he was going out there and was really passionate about a certain thing.
But that's what Sam Harris wants, because Sam Harris is projecting
They want
his
this kind of monotone politician.
Because that's who he is.
Yeah.
It's the most raw form. Look, it's one thing to have a conversation about identity politics, about groups, particularly groups that are presently and historically repressed. I think we can all agree that literal identity politics, as in I as a singular soul individual would like my personal biases represented in a candidate, I think we all could hold a check on. So I understand why Sam Harris specifically wants a young Mike in his, of course, it being Sam Harris, we're still not even talking about a thing that actually exists. But I understand why he would want something like that. But it doesn't represent anything other than a small of other cluster of people who are already way over influential. And let me just add one other thing. He's alluding to there, and he actually, he's talking about the left eating its own in another part of the clip. And again, I think, coming to the right place in the wrong way about some of the aspects of this culture that I certainly don't like. But I think a big part of the problem with like that culture he's talking about is hyper literalism and a complete reduction of human beings to a one-dimensional variable, which is how Sam Harris got his start. He's trying to cancel over 1 billion human beings on this fucking planet, which are Muslims. And that's the commonality. See, he manifests it in a different way, but he's the same thought process that he's objecting to. There's no nuance, there's no terrain, there's no empathy, there's no room for adaptability, there's no contextual circumstances, there's nothing. There's just, I read this, I don't like that, that's it. And at least on the left side, it's a reaction to things that are actual problems. He's going and saying Al-Qaeda, therefore over 1 billion people. So he has fed in his public discourse precisely that punitive literalist approach as much as anybody.
Yeah, well, it's like somebody like Sam Harris, when he's advocating, look, and he does it, he speaks very slowly and calmly. But, his politics, he's very much advocating for the wheel of capitalism, imperialism, and neoliberalism to crush not only billions of people, but in that specific clip that we were talking about, when he's talking about trans rights, and as you rightfully pointed out, no one's coming on, pushing some kind of radical agenda. What he's saying,
they're talking about equity.
Yeah, no,
equity.
Like basic human compassion and like defending, basic human rights.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but literally at a time when this administration is talking about canceling it as a fucking identity, and literally. And he's saying,
he says, what we need to do is we need to stomp on vulnerable people so that we can get Trump out of office. And it's so cynical because, he doesn't, because to say that you have to not care about that group of people. And I'll say that very and it's like, he has such a fixation on this issue, and then he builds it up into something that doesn't exist so that he can negate, because he can't go on and say, I'm against human rights for trans people. That's not what he's going to push. He's going to do these kind of run through.
And by the way,
I'm just against how much you're for those rights.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is why, by the way, you need to do, and I'll be intentionally provocative, you need to have a bad faith reading of Sam Harris, because there are absolutely people, and I do see it inside the left. I agree with Ben Burgess. I think it's a problem inside the left. People have migrated tactics that do work for Ben Shapiro to arguments inside the left where there are valid positions, and you need to figure out arguments, and things like reading people charitably is a valid term. But when your whole public persona is based on playing word games and speaking out of both sides of your mouth, as an umbrella to forward toxic stances towards Muslims, transgender people, African Americans, all just because you're just in the complete uninterrupted bubble of your own identity and unchallenged ideological perceptions because you have no empathy or historical curiosity. I can't read that empathetically. There's or charitably, because there's the context behind that is you're somebody who's constantly going after these communities. That's what your context is. You didn't. If he had a different trajectory, I would disagree, but I would note there's a different origin here for that point. The origin here for that point is he's been doing that shit his whole career.
Yeah, and that's what you said about how there's this contingent of people online who are so concerned with being fair to Sam Harris, whereas Sam Harris has purposely chosen these topics. If he wants to speak truth about this shit, he should be ready for the blowback that comes and
100%.
take it. Like this 100%. This is comes with the territory, buddy.
And by the way, own your position. I actually think, in some ways he draws more heat than people who, people say, well, why not this person and that person and da-da-da. And it's like, well, first of all, because he takes the simple-minded and literalists down this path more so than other people.
Well, it's like,
and then secondly, it's like, frankly, and I should say, and also, to be fair, some people who are more intelligent and more sophisticated, but then there's also like, people who are just making an assertion that we might profoundly disagree with and fight against, but we don't have to do all of this legwork to fight through the disingenuousness of what their position actually is. Like, what if we played word games all day to say, like, because clearly we support Medicare for all, but what if we played word games to create the plausible deniability of support for said position? Would that annoy you?
Yeah, I mean, certainly.
I mean,
No, but it's like, and the thing with somebody like Harris is there's such a radical difference, and I think this is the point that we really should be making between Mark Fisher when he's writing about exiting the vampire castle.
That's precisely,
and his like criticism of the left, and what Sam Harris is doing, right? And because Sam Harris is cynically taking on a feeling that some people have that, maybe there might be excesses to this movement or some tactics that are wrong, and is using that as a shield to actually trample on the important rights that people are advocating for.
I was on a panel once during the primary, and I was talking about how the Clinton campaign was, in that context, weaponizing this and that in these incredibly cynical, dishonest ways. And this Republican on the panel was like, it's just amazing to hear someone on the left. And I said, but dude, you guys are racist.
Well, you guys
I was like, no, I got you. You are.
Well, it's like I can't remember who made this joke on Twitter, but it's like a conservative says, "I've just been censored for my beliefs," and they're like, "Oh, what? You were just censored for wanting lower taxes?" And like, no, not those beliefs. "Oh, you were just censored for wanting less regulation?" No, not those ones either. It's
right.
like which ones.
I think everybody knows it. You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video. And you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.